My dad told my stepmom to leave after she insulted my late mom at family dinner and now she's threatening to take everything. I'm 26 years old and I just watched my dad's second marriage implode in the span of 3 days. I need to write this out because the situation keeps getting worse and I don't know what to do. My mom died when I was 12, ovarian cancer. The diagnosis came in January and she was gone by August. It was brutal and fast and it destroyed our family in ways we're still dealing with. My younger brother Qley was 9 when mom died. He has fewer memories of her than I do, which kills me. I remember her reading to us every night, planning elaborate themed birthday parties, singing off key while she cooked. Qley just has fragments. Dad was completely hollowed out after she died. He went through the motions for years, work, parenting, existing, but there was no light in him. He didn't date, didn't even seem interested in the possibility. 9 years passed like that. Then he met Harlo at some charity gala his architecture firm sponsored. She was 38 to his 54, corporate event planner, divorced once, no kids of her own. They dated for 2 years before getting engaged. I was 21 and in college. Qley was 18 and a senior in high school. I never fully warmed to Harlo. She was polished and professional and said all the right things, but something about her felt calculated, like she was performing the role of supportive partner rather than actually being one. Dad seemed lighter though, more present, so I kept my concerns to myself and tried to be supportive. They got married 3 years ago, small ceremony at the house with just immediate family. Harlo had wanted something bigger at a nice venue but Dad insisted he couldn't do another big wedding. His first one to my mom had been this huge event with 200 guests and he said doing that again felt wrong. Harlo smiled and agreed but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. The first year of marriage was relatively smooth. Harlo made efforts with me and Qley, invited us to dinners, asked about our lives, tried to establish relationships. It felt somewhat forced but I appreciated that she was trying. Then small things started bothering me. She'd begun rearranging the house and getting rid of things. Mom's favorite reading chair disappeared one day. Harlo said it was worn out and she'd donated it to charity. Some of Mom's artwork came down from the walls. Harlo explained she was updating the decor to make the space feel more current. Dad went along with these changes, said he'd agreed to them, that he needed to move forward instead of living in the past, but watching Mom's presence slowly erased from our home felt wrong. The worst was the garden. Mom had been passionate about native plants and had spent years cultivating this beautiful garden with careful attention to what would thrive in our climate. Harlo ripped it all out and put in these modern ornamental grasses and decorative rocks, said the old garden looked dated and required too much maintenance. Dad didn't fight her on it, just let her erase years of Mom's work. Qley started avoiding family dinners. When I asked why, he said Harlo made comments sometimes, nothing overtly cruel, just small observations about how he should be more ambitious, more outgoing, more focused on his future. I mentioned it to Dad. He said Harlo was just trying to encourage Qley to reach his potential, that her intentions were good even if her delivery was sometimes clumsy. I let it go because I had my own life to focus on. I'd graduated and started working at a marketing firm, had my own apartment across town. I saw them maybe twice a month for dinner. Things continued that way for 2 years, surface level pleasant with undercurrents of tension I mostly ignored. Last Sunday was supposed to be a normal family dinner. Me, Qley who's 23 now and in his second year at state school, Dad, and Harlo. Harlo had been drinking wine while she cooked. She does that fairly regularly, goes through a bottle or two over the course of preparing dinner. Dad has mentioned it bothers him but she always brushes it off as just relaxing after a long week. By the time we sat down to eat, she was clearly past tipsy. Her voice was too loud and her movements were loose and uncoordinated. Qley mentioned he was thinking about changing his major from business to environmental science. He'd always been interested in ecology and conservation. As a kid he'd spend hours in Mom's garden learning plant names and understanding ecosystems. Harlo actually laughed when he said it, not a kind laugh, more like she'd heard something absurd. She said environmental science was a waste of a degree and that Qley needed to think practically about supporting himself instead of chasing some idealistic fantasy about saving the planet. Qley went quiet. Dad told Harlo that was harsh and unnecessary. She waved him off, said someone needed to give Qley realistic advice since Dad was too soft on him to be honest. Then she said the thing that ended her marriage. If his mother were still alive she'd probably encourage this nonsense. She always did baby him. The room went completely silent. I stared at her, genuinely shocked. Dad's face drained of color. Qley stood up without a word and left the table, went upstairs to his old bedroom and shut the door hard enough that we heard it throughout the house. I asked Harlo what the hell was wrong with her. She got immediately defensive, insisted she was just being honest, that Mom had been overprotective of us and that's why Qley struggled with direction now. Dad spoke then. His voice was quiet but there was something hard in it I'd never heard before. He told Harlo to leave. She laughed, thought he was joking. He repeated it, told her to pack a bag and get out of his house, that he wouldn't sit at his table with someone who disrespected my mom's memory like that. Harlo's expression changed as she realized he was serious. She immediately started backtracking, said she didn't mean it the way it sounded, that the wine had loosened her tongue, that she was sorry if she'd offended anyone. Dad didn't budge. He said he'd given her chance after chance to be respectful of his past and his first marriage, that this wasn't just about tonight, it was about 3 years of slowly erasing my mom from their lives while pretending to be supportive. He said he was done making excuses for her behavior, she needed to leave now. Harlo started crying, actual tears streaming down her face as she begged him not to do this, said she'd made a mistake but she loved him and didn't want to lose their marriage over one comment made while drunk. Dad called her an Uber, told her to stay at a hotel for the night and that they'd discuss things when she was sober. She left still crying, shooting me looks like somehow this was my fault for not defending her. After she was gone, Dad went upstairs to check on Crew. I could hear them talking through the door but couldn't make out the specific words. The tone seemed calm at least. When Dad came back downstairs he looked absolutely exhausted. He sat at the kitchen table and told me he should have ended things with Harlo months ago, that he'd known the marriage wasn't working but kept hoping it would improve. I asked what he meant by months ago, what else had happened that I didn't know about. He explained that Harlo had been making comments about Mom for a while now, nothing as blatant as what she'd said tonight, but a steady stream of suggestions that he needed to let go of the past, that keeping photos up and talking about Mom was preventing him from fully moving on, that the house felt like a shrine to a dead woman instead of a home for living people. She'd pushed him to take down pictures, to box up Mom's belongings that he'd kept in storage, to stop mentioning Mom around Crew because it made Harlo uncomfortable to constantly hear about his first wife. Dad had complied with some of it to keep the peace, put away a few photos, stopped bringing Mom up in casual conversation, but he'd been feeling increasingly resentful about it. Tonight had just been the final straw, the moment where he couldn't pretend anymore that this marriage was healthy or sustainable. I stayed with Dad and Crew that night. We ended up pulling out old photo albums and looking through pictures of Mom, crying and laughing and sharing memories without anyone telling us we needed to move on or let go. Harlo started texting around midnight, long messages apologizing and saying she was mortified by her behavior, begging Dad to let her come home so they could talk about this properly. He didn't respond to any of them. The next morning she showed up at the house. Dad wouldn't let her inside. He talked to her through the front door and said he wanted a separation while he figured out what he wanted. That's when Harlo completely lost it, started screaming about how she'd given up 3 years of her life for him and his family, how she'd tried so hard to fit in and be accepted, how ungrateful we all were for everything she'd done. Dad told her to leave the property or he'd call the police. She left but not before shouting that he was going to regret treating her this way. That was Monday. Today is Thursday and the situation has escalated dramatically in ways I never could have anticipated. Harlo hired a divorce attorney, not for a separation or trial period, straight to divorce. Her lawyer sent a formal letter to Dad yesterday outlining her demands. She wants half of everything, the house, Dad's retirement accounts, his investment portfolio, his savings, everything he's built over 30 years. Dad called his own lawyer immediately. She explained that because they've been married for 3 years and we live in a community property state, Harlo might actually be entitled to a significant portion of his assets. The house is the biggest issue. Dad bought it 27 years ago with my mom. They paid off the mortgage together over 20 years. Mom lived there until she died. But because Dad has been married to Harlo for 3 years and she's lived in the house as his legal wife, she's claiming she has rights to it in the divorce. My mom's house, the house where we grew up, where all our memories of her exist. Harlo's lawyer is arguing that Dad's overall net worth increased substantially during the marriage due to investments and career advancement, that Harlo contributed to the household and supported his career and deserves to be compensated accordingly. Dad's lawyer says they can fight these claims but it's going to be expensive and potentially ugly, that the best case scenario is still Harlo walking away with a substantial settlement. Dad is completely devastated, keeps saying he can't believe he let someone like Harlo into our lives, that he betrayed Mom's memory by marrying someone who would try to erase her and then try to take everything she left behind. I told him he didn't betray anyone, that he was lonely and grieving and made a mistake, that Mom would have wanted him to try to find happiness again even if it didn't work out. But honestly I'm furious that this woman came into our lives, systematically dismantled everything that reminded us of Mom, and is now trying to take the actual house where we built our family. Crew has barely spoken since everything happened, not because he's angry at Dad. He feels guilty. He thinks if he hadn't mentioned changing his major, none of this would have happened, that his career choices somehow caused the marriage to end. I've tried explaining that Harlo's comment was just the catalyst, that this marriage was ending regardless, but he's 23 and processing everything through the lens of his own responsibility. My family is falling apart, again, just like it did when Mom got sick 14 years ago. And I have absolutely no idea how to fix any of it. Update, 2 weeks later. The situation has gotten exponentially worse and I discovered something that changes the entire context of this divorce. Harlo's lawyer sent another letter last week escalating her demands. She now wants spousal support on top of the asset division. Her argument is that she gave up career advancement opportunities to support dad and manage the household. This is completely absurd. She maintained her event planning business throughout the entire marriage. She didn't sacrifice anything career-wise. Dad's lawyer advised him to start gathering financial documentation, proof of what assets he owned before the marriage, records of how things were acquired, anything that could protect what was his before Harlo entered the picture. Dad asked me to help him go through old files in his home office. He's never been particularly organized with paperwork and needed someone to sort through years of accumulated documents. I spent last Saturday at the house going through filing cabinets, bank statements, investment records, mortgage documents, tax returns going back decades. That's when I found it. A life insurance policy on my mom, issued 3 years before she died, benefit amount of $1.8 million. I knew there had been life insurance. That's how Dad paid off the remaining mortgage and covered Mom's medical bills and kept us financially stable after her death, but I'd never known the specific amount. I kept digging through the files, found records showing the payout came through about 4 months after Mom died. Dad had deposited it into a separate savings account, not his regular checking, a completely different account at a different bank. Then I found statements for that account going back years. The balance had grown substantially through conservative investments. The current balance was sitting at just over $2.4 million. And then I found something that made my stomach drop. A document from 14 months into Dad's marriage to Harlo, a transfer authorization moving the entire balance from that separate account into a joint account with both their names on it. Dad had put Mom's life insurance money, the money that came directly from her death, into a joint account with Harlo. I took the documents downstairs where Dad was making lunch, asked him to explain what I was looking at. The color drained from his face, he sat down heavily and said he'd made a terrible mistake. Apparently Harlo had been pushing for combined finances almost from the beginning of the marriage. She'd made it this whole thing about trust and partnership, said that married couples who truly loved each other shared everything, that keeping money separate showed a fundamental lack of commitment. Dad had resisted initially. That account was different from his other assets. It was Mom's money in a very real sense, money that existed because she'd died. He'd always thought of it as something sacred that should go to me and crew eventually. But Harlo kept pushing, started making comments about how he clearly didn't see her as a real wife if he wouldn't share his finances with her, how she'd combined everything with him but he was holding back from her. She'd frame it as being hurt rather than angry, said it made her feel like an outsider in her own marriage. Eventually Dad gave in. He transferred the money into a joint account thinking it would make Harlo feel more secure and stop the constant conversations about trust. He'd planned to transfer it back out at some point but just never got around to it. Then as time passed he'd honestly kind of forgotten that account even existed since he never touched it. I asked if he understood what this meant legally. That account was joint. Harlo had equal legal claim to every dollar in it. $1.2 million of my mom's life insurance money was about to go to the woman who'd spent 3 years trying to erase her memory from our lives. Dad looked like he might physically be sick. I called his lawyer immediately, explained the situation with the life insurance money and the joint account. Her response was not encouraging. She said it was a serious problem. Once money goes into a joint account it's generally considered marital property regardless of where it originally came from. The fact that it came from before the marriage should matter, but Dad voluntarily putting it into a joint account severely complicated things. We could try to argue that it was separate property due to its source, but proving that Dad was coerced or manipulated into combining that specific account would be difficult. Otherwise Harlo had a completely legitimate legal claim to half of it. The lawyer said we needed documentation, any emails or texts where Harlo had pushed for combined finances, any evidence that she'd been manipulative or deceptive about her intentions. I was absolutely furious, asked Dad how he could have been so careless with something that important. He just kept saying he'd trusted her, that he'd thought they were building a life together and sharing finances was a normal part of that he'd never imagined the marriage would end like this with her trying to take everything. Crew came home while we were still talking and overheard enough to understand what had happened. He completely lost it. Started yelling at Dad about how that money was supposed to be for us, how Mom died and left us that money and now he'd just given it away to someone who hated everything about her. Dad tried to explain his thought process but Crew wouldn't listen, said he couldn't believe Dad had been so stupid with the only thing Mom left behind. Then he grabbed his keys and left, just walked out and drove away, wouldn't answer calls or texts for hours. Dad sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands saying he'd destroyed everything, that he'd failed Mom by letting Harlo into our lives and failed us by being careless with her legacy. I wanted to be angry at him but mostly I just felt exhausted and sad. He'd been lonely and vulnerable and made bad decisions. Now we were all paying for it. Crew finally came back around 11 that night. He'd been driving around thinking. He apologized for yelling and said he wasn't actually mad at Dad, he was just scared of losing everything that connected us to Mom. We stayed up until almost 3 in the morning talking, about Mom, about Harlo, about how to move forward from this mess. Dad said he'd fight for the house no matter what it took, that Harlo could take money but she wasn't getting the home where we'd built our family and where all our memories of Mom existed. The next morning Dad's lawyer called with some potentially relevant information. She'd done some preliminary research into Harlo's background and finances and found some interesting things. Harlo's event planning business was doing significantly worse than she'd been letting on. She had substantial debts, maxed out credit cards, business loans in default. The whole operation was basically failing. The lawyer thought this was potentially relevant to the case. It suggested Harlo might have married Dad at least partially for financial security rather than purely for love, that her insistence on combining finances might have been strategic rather than emotional. She recommended hiring a forensic accountant to go through the joint account transaction history, see if there was any evidence of Harlo moving money around or making unusual purchases that Dad wasn't aware of. We hired one immediately. Within 3 days he'd found something significant. Over the past 2.5 years, Harlo had transferred nearly $460,000 from the joint account to various places, her business accounts, personal credit cards, investments in friends' ventures that had all failed. She'd been systematically draining that account while Dad wasn't paying attention to it. When confronted with this information in a preliminary meeting, Harlo's lawyer tried to argue that she had every right to use joint marital funds however she saw fit, that Dad had given her equal access and never objected because he didn't monitor the account. Technically that was true. Dad had basically forgotten the account existed once he'd transferred the money. But it strengthened our argument significantly that Harlo had manipulated Dad into combining finances specifically so she could access that money for her failing business. Dad's lawyer filed an emergency motion to freeze all joint accounts pending the divorce proceedings. The judge granted it within 48 hours. Harlo absolutely lost her mind, started calling Dad at all hours screaming about how he was trying to leave her destitute, how she'd put up with his obsession with his dead wife for 3 years and deserved to be compensated for that emotional labor. Dad started recording the calls after the second one. She said a lot of things she probably shouldn't have while angry. Talked about how she'd always resented my mom's presence in the house, how she'd been planning to eventually convince Dad to sell and move somewhere new where she could build her own memories without competing with a ghost. How she'd known within the first year that the marriage was probably a mistake but stayed anyway because leaving would mean walking away from financial security. Dad's lawyer was thrilled when she heard those recordings, said they showed Harlo's true motivations and would significantly help our case. We're now in full litigation mode. Both sides have completely abandoned any pretense of this being amicable. Harlo's latest strategy has been going to Dad's friends and extended family with her version of events, telling people that Dad blindsided her, that she devoted herself to his family only to be thrown away over one drunken comment. Some people have bought it. Dad's brother actually called him last week and said he thought Dad was being too harsh, that everyone makes mistakes when they drink and Harlo deserved forgiveness. Dad told his brother he had no idea what he was actually talking about and hung up. The family has divided into camps, some people supporting Dad, others thinking he's overreacting and being cruel to Harlo. They don't know about the years of subtle erasure, the pressure on Crew, the manipulation around finances, the systematic draining of the life insurance account. They just see a woman who made one mistake being punished severely for it. I've stopped trying to explain the full situation to people who don't want to understand it. If they can't see what Harlo actually is, that's their problem. Right now my only focus is protecting Dad and Crew and making sure Harlo doesn't walk away with everything Mom left us. Update, 6 weeks later. The forensic accountant finished his complete analysis and what he found is even worse than we initially thought. Over the past 2.5 years that Harlo had access to the joint account, she didn't just transfer money, she transferred almost $460,000 to various places. Luxury purchases Dad knew nothing about, a car registered only in her name, designer handbags, and jewelry she'd been hiding, investments in multiple friends' businesses that had all failed, money to her sister for unexplained reasons. She'd been systematically looting that account while Dad ignored it. When confronted about this in her deposition, Harlo claimed she'd thought that's what the money was for, joint expenses and discretionary spending for both of them, said Dad had never set any restrictions on how she could use it. Her lawyer argued that once money is in a joint account, both parties have completely equal rights to use it however they want. Technically that's true from a legal standpoint, but it doesn't change the fact that she'd been deceptive about the extent of her spending. Dad's lawyer countered that Harlo had deliberately concealed these purchases and transfers, that she'd manipulated Dad into giving her access and then exploited his inattention. Then our lawyer subpoenaed Harlo's personal email and phone records as part of discovery, found messages between Harlo and her sister from almost 2 years ago. In them, Harlo complained extensively about being stuck in a marriage with a man who was still in love with his dead wife, said the only reason she was staying was the financial stability and access to Dad's assets, that once she'd been married long enough to have a strong claim in a divorce, she'd find a way out. She'd literally been planning an exit strategy for 2 years. The emails also revealed something else. Harlo had been having an affair. Some guy named Ezra she'd met through her event planning business. They'd been involved for at least 10 months based on the message history. Dad was blindsided. He'd had absolutely no idea. Harlo had been careful about it, meeting Ezra during work hours, claiming late nights at events, keeping everything separate. When Harlo's lawyer was presented with these emails during discovery, they tried to claim the messages were being taken out of context, that Harlo had been venting to her sister during rough patches in the marriage but hadn't actually meant the things she'd written. But the timestamps told a very different story. These weren't isolated complaints during one bad period, they were consistent over nearly 2 years. This was her actual mindset throughout most of the marriage. The judge was clearly not impressed during the preliminary hearing, especially when the affair came to light. In our state, adultery can significantly impact asset division in a divorce. Judges have discretion to award less to a spouse who's been unfaithful. The judge indicated she was inclined to view Harlo's financial claims less favorably given the evidence of her planning to exploit the marriage financially while simultaneously being unfaithful. Harlo's lawyer tried a desperate move, argued that Dad's continued devotion to my mom's memory throughout the marriage constituted a form of emotional infidelity, that he'd never fully committed to Harlo because he was still emotionally involved with his deceased first wife. The judge shut that down immediately, said grief over a deceased spouse is absolutely not equivalent to adultery and she didn't want to hear that argument again. We're now looking at a settlement that's much more favorable than we'd initially feared. The house will stay entirely with Dad. Harlo's claim to it has been severely weakened by all the evidence of bad faith throughout the marriage. The joint account situation is more complicated. She spent $460,000 of it, but there's still about $1.9 million remaining. The judge will likely split what's currently in the account, but Dad's lawyer is arguing Harlo should have to account for what she already took. If the judge agrees, Harlo might end up with only about $400,000 total from that account, basically just what she already spent. Not nothing, but nowhere near the multiple millions she was originally demanding. Dad has been processing everything. He's angry but mostly just profoundly sad, said he genuinely cared about Harlo when they first got together, that he'd wanted to build a new chapter of his life while still honoring his past. But Harlo never wanted that. She wanted him to completely erase Mom, and when he wouldn't, she decided to wait it out and extract as much money as she could before leaving. Qley has actually been doing surprisingly well through all of this. I think seeing Harlo's true nature spelled out explicitly in emails and financial records has given him a strange kind of closure. Now he knows definitively that the problem was never him, it was entirely her. He's back to enthusiastically talking about environmental science. Dad has been completely supportive, saying Qley should study what he's passionate about and that Mom would be proud of him for following his interests. We went to visit Mom's grave last weekend, all 3 of us together for the first time since her funeral. Dad broke down completely, apologized to Mom for bringing someone into our lives who disrespected her, for letting Harlo change the house and destroy her garden, for putting her life insurance money at risk. Qley and I told him that Mom would understand, that she'd want him to have tried to find happiness again, that what happened with Harlo wasn't his fault. He was manipulated by someone who turned out to be calculating and cruel. We're making plans to restore Mom's garden once all of this is finally over, rip out Harlo's modern redesign completely and replant everything Mom originally chose. We found an old landscaping plan Mom had drawn up and we're going to recreate it exactly. Dad has also started bringing back some of the changes Harlo made to the house, rehanging photos of Mom that had been taken down, bringing her belongings back out of storage. He said he'd tried to move forward by moving on, but he realizes now that was wrong. Moving forward means bringing Mom with us as part of our lives, not erasing her to make room for someone new. Final update, 3 months later. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago and I can finally close this chapter completely. The final settlement, Dad keeps the house and all assets he owned prior to the marriage. Harlo receives $420,000 from the joint account, essentially what she'd already spent, so she gets nothing beyond what she already took. No spousal support. The judge cited Harlo's infidelity, demonstrated bad faith throughout the marriage, and deliberate concealment of spending as reasons to deny it entirely. Harlo's lawyer tried to file an appeal but was advised by multiple colleagues that it was pointless given the strength of evidence against her. Harlo sent Dad one final email after the settlement was official. She didn't apologize or show any remorse. Instead she said he'd wasted years of her life and that she regretted every day she'd spent trying to fit into his pathetic shrine to a dead woman. Dad deleted it without responding. There's nothing to say to someone like that. Apparently she's still with Ezra. I heard through mutual acquaintances that her event planning business finally folded completely last month. She's working as an assistant at someone else's firm now. Part of me feels satisfied by that. Mostly, I just don't care what happens to her anymore. The house has been completely transformed back over the past few months. We spent weeks undoing Harlo's changes throughout every room. The garden restoration was finished last month. We found a landscaper who specialized in native plant restoration, and she helped us recreate Mom's original design from the plants we found. Every perennial Mom had chosen is back exactly where it belonged. Dad rehung all the pictures of Mom, not just in the hallway but throughout the entire house, photos of her laughing, working in the garden, with me and Crew when we were little. Harlo had made the house feel sterile and impersonal, like a staged showroom. Now it feels like our home again. Crew is absolutely thriving. He officially declared environmental science as his major and has already gotten involved in research projects on campus. He has a girlfriend now who he brought home for dinner last month. Her name is Paisley and she's studying biology. She was genuinely interested in hearing about Mom when she saw all the photos. Crew showed her the restored garden and explained all the plants Mom had chosen and why. It was healing to watch. Dad is doing better than any of us expected. He's been going to therapy consistently to process everything that happened, says he's learned a lot about himself, including that he'd rushed into marriage with Harlo because he was afraid of being alone rather than because he'd actually been ready. He's not dating and says he probably won't for a long time, maybe never, and he seems genuinely at peace with that possibility. We've established a new routine, family dinners every Sunday, just the three of us. We cook together, talk about our weeks, share memories of Mom. Sometimes we cry, sometimes we laugh, but it feels authentic in a way it never did when Harlo was around. I've been processing my own feelings about everything. For a while I was angry at Dad for bringing Harlo into our lives in the first place, for letting her make changes, for being careless with Mom's money. But I understand now that he was just trying to survive his grief. He made mistakes, but they came from loneliness and hope rather than malice or carelessness. And ultimately we got through it, battered and $420,000 lighter than we should be, but together and stronger. The money Harlo took still bothers me sometimes. That was Mom's money, meant to take care of us after she was gone. $420,000 wasted on a manipulative woman's shopping habits and failing business ventures. But Dad's lawyer did manage to protect the bulk of his wealth through some strategic financial documentation. We're not struggling. The house is secure. Crew's education is fully funded. I'm financially stable in my own career. We'll be fine. Last week was the 15th anniversary of Mom's death. We spent the day together, visited her grave, looked through photo albums, cooked her favorite recipes. Crew said something that really stuck with me. He said he used to feel guilty that he barely remembers Mom clearly, but now he realizes he knows her through all of us, through the stories Dad tells, the traditions I've maintained, the garden we restored together. That her memory isn't just individual recollection, but something we carry forward collectively as a family. Dad started crying when Crew said that. Happy tears for once. This whole nightmare with Harlo taught us something important. We'd been so afraid of losing Mom's memory that we'd become protective of it in unhealthy ways. Dad tried to move on by erasing her, which failed, then he'd swung back to holding on to everything so tightly he couldn't function. Now we're finding actual balance. Mom is part of our daily lives but she doesn't define every single moment. We can talk about her freely without it being devastating. We can honor her without being frozen in grief. Harlo ironically forced us to figure out what actually mattered. When she tried to take everything, we had to identify what was truly worth fighting for. It wasn't primarily the money, though that mattered. It wasn't even entirely the house, though we love it. It was the right to remember Mom on our own terms, to keep her present in our lives without someone demanding we let go and move on according to their timeline. And we won that fight decisively. Dad said something interesting last week. He thinks Mom would have seen through Harlo immediately, that Mom had excellent instincts about people and would have recognized the performance and manipulation from the beginning. He wishes he'd trusted his own instincts more. There were warning signs from early on. Harlo's insistence on changing things, her comments about Crew, her constant need to be the center of attention. But he'd been so desperate for companionship that he'd ignored all of it. He's not making that mistake again. If he ever does date in the future, he'll be honest from the start about who he is. A man who loved his first wife deeply and always will. Anyone who can't accept that isn't right for him. I'm proud of him for reaching that understanding. My own life has moved forward too. I've been seeing someone for about 2 months now. His name is Kai and he's a teacher at an alternative school. He knows everything about what happened with Harlo. I told him early because I needed to see how he'd respond to the complexity and mess of my family situation. He listened to the whole story and then said his dad had died when he was young, that he understood the weight of losing a parent and how it shapes everything that comes after. We bonded over that shared experience of early loss. It feels significant in a way my previous relationships haven't. Crew likes him, which matters more than I expected. He said Kai seems genuine and present, unlike Harlo who always felt performative. The legal fees from the divorce were substantial, just over $90,000, but Dad says it was worth every penny to protect what mattered and expose Harlo's true nature before she could do more damage. His lawyer has actually become something of a family friend. She came to dinner a few weeks ago and we toasted to hard-won victories. She said in 28 years of family law practice, she'd rarely encountered someone as calculating as Harlo. That validation helped somehow, like we weren't stupid for not seeing it earlier. She was just exceptionally skilled at manipulation. We heard through a mutual friend that Harlo actually tried to contact Dad about 2 months after the divorce was finalized, sent some long letter about how she'd made mistakes and wanted to talk about reconciliation. Dad didn't even read it, just handed it directly to his lawyer who sent an immediate cease and desist letter. Some people genuinely don't deserve second chances. The house feels completely reclaimed now. Every room has been touched and adjusted, not redecorated entirely, just restored. Harlo's cold modern aesthetic has been replaced with warmth and personality and memories. We found boxes of Mom's belongings in storage that Harlo had convinced Dad to pack away. Her favorite blankets, artwork she'd collected over years, books with her handwritten notes in the margins. Everything is back exactly where it belongs. Crew framed one of Mom's original garden sketches. She used to draw detailed seasonal planting plans. It's hanging in the kitchen now where we see it multiple times every day. Dad says walking through the house doesn't hurt the way it used to. For years after Mom died, every corner reminded him of devastating loss. Then Harlo erased those reminders and it felt wrong in a completely different way. Now the house is full of Mom's presence, but it doesn't feel like a mausoleum. She's woven into our daily life, which is exactly right. I think that's what actual healing looks like, not forgetting, not being consumed by grief, but finding a sustainable way to carry the people we've lost forward with us. Harlo wanted us to choose between remembering Mom and moving forward. She presented them as mutually exclusive options. But they never were. We can honor our past and build our future simultaneously without contradiction. That's what we're doing now. Last Sunday's dinner was particularly meaningful. Crew brought Paisley, I brought Kai. We cooked Mom's recipe for mushroom risotto and her lemon cake for dessert. Halfway through dinner, Paisley asked about the photos throughout the house. We ended up spending over an hour telling stories about Mom, funny ones mostly, the time she accidentally used salt instead of sugar in cookies, when she convinced Dad to dress as a dragon for my 8th birthday party, her completely tone-deaf singing voice that she deployed constantly anyway. Kai and Paisley listened and laughed and asked questions. They weren't uncomfortable with Mom's presence or trying to change the subject. They understood she was part of our family story. After they left, Dad said he hadn't felt that content in years, that the house felt full in exactly the right way, not crowded with someone demanding attention, but warm with people who genuinely cared about each other. Crew agreed completely, said this felt like actual family in a way it never had with Harlo present. I realized then that we'd survived something that could have genuinely destroyed us. Harlo had entered our lives during a vulnerable period and tried to reshape us into something we weren't. She failed. We're still ourselves, still a family bound by love and loss and the memory of an extraordinary woman who died far too young. Harlo took some money and 3 years of our time and caused substantial pain, but she didn't take what actually mattered. And now she's gone while we're still here, stronger for having fought to protect what we love. I don't know what comes next for any of us. Dad might eventually date again or might not. Crew will graduate and build his own life. I'll keep moving forward with Kai or someone else or on my own. But whatever happens, we'll face it together, as a family that knows its own worth and won't compromise on what matters. Mom would be proud of that. And honestly, so am I. This chapter is completely closed now. Harlo is nothing more than a footnote in our family history, a cautionary tale about what happens when someone tries to erase love rather than build upon it. We're moving forward now, together.